In the last lesson, we reviewed the query method. And now I called this an anti-pattern because of the way that we are binding user-supplied data to the string. Now, query does have its use. When you're in cases where you can just hard code the value in, like this, in that case, it actually is very helpful. Because of the way the results are returned, you can immediately run a for each on the data and get access to those rows. So I only want you to use the query method when you're hard coding the entire string. If no user-supplied data is being added to that SQL query, feel free to use it. However, when you are working with maybe form input, maybe the user is registering and you need to take the input values that they filled out and bind it to your SQL query, in those cases, always use prepared statements. Let's take a look. I'm going to delete this line entirely. And now we're going to say our statement is equal to connection, and we're going to prepare a new query. And this query will be select star, once again from the users table, where the ID column equals, and this time rather than using like the quote method or MySQL real escape string, which is a function you might be familiar with, instead I'm going to use a named parameter like this. So what we're doing here is we're saying we're going to prepare a new query. And the query is select everything from the users table where the ID column equals, and then we set up this placeholder. Feel free to call that placeholder or named parameter. Just think of it as a spot where we will bind a value to it. So now we run this, and that's going to be sent off to the database. The query is prepared, but it's not been executed just yet. Before we can do that, we need to, of course, bind the value. Now I'm going to execute it. So I will run statement execute. And within here, we can optionally pass an array that will contain all of the values that we need to bind. So we'll do that right now. And within here, we'll say we're going to bind ID to the ID variable that we created earlier. In this case, we just hard-coded a variable of 3. So now we're executing that. And now I can get rid of this for each statement and say while row equals statement fetch print r row. And let's see what we get there. I'll come back, reload the page, and sure enough, now we get that single array, but now we are binding the parameter, which is infinitely more secure. I want to go over this one more time. Remember, this query is already being sent off before the value has been bound. And then we execute it and we take these values and bind it after the fact. And that way, the value in this ID variable is never actually being embedded into our SQL query. And that way, we never have to worry about the user trying to be clever and finding a way to drop our database or table. Or even worse, access information that they really don't need to have access to. Now in this case, when we added the array as a parameter, another way would be to use the bind param method. So what we're saying here is we're going to bind a parameter to that ID named parameter, or the placeholder that we set right here. And what are we going to bind to it? Well, we're going to bind that variable right here. And then finally, which is really helpful, is we can specify the type. In this case, param int, and that means we are binding an integer to this query. We're not binding a string or something else, we are binding an integer. Then we can simply run execute with no params. And I'm sorry, I need to make sure I add PDO and then grab that as a static property. So once again, if I run it in the browser, yep, we get the exact same thing. So both options are perfectly valid, just use whatever is most convenient in your situation. Now I want you to note that when we called the fetch method, it was returned as an array. And in this case, we only have one item, but what if we want it returned as an object? Well, you know what? To illustrate this, add a few more items to that table. So here I am within terminal. I'm going to use the practice database, and we'll select star from the users table. Let's just add a couple more users. We will insert into the users table, the username, and the values will be John Doe. We'll do a couple more, James Doe. And one more, maybe Jim Doe, and let's do one that does not begin with J, Frank Doe. All right, so let's select star from the users, and we have a bunch of users names. A lot of them begin with J, and now I'll show you why we did that. Let's come back to Sublime Text, and now we're going to change our query to select star from users where the username, and we'll use a new command like. And within here I can say J %. So let's just run that and make sure it works. reload the page, view the source, and notice that now I have returned all of these items just as long as the username begins with J. So how does this work? Well, what we're saying here is we are looking for rows that are like what we pass. And what we're passing here is we're going to look for all records for username where they begin with J, and then percentage is a wildcard that will represent one or more of any character. As another example, maybe we want to select all users where the second letter is R. Okay, well in that case we would say underscore, and that's going to represent any single character, then R, then percentage. So let's run this in the browser. And now notice that the second letter of Frank is R, and the second letter once again is R. So this time we are beginning with underscore, any character, then we need to find an R, and then we're just looking for any number of characters after that. It doesn't matter. So let's go back, now that we understand this, when we are looking for usernames that begin with J, that letter might be something that is coming from the form. Maybe there's a drop-down and you want to sort the list by last name, and you can select the letter to begin with. Well, in that case, we will say letter. We'll assume that that's been hard-coded in, like so. And now I can change this to like letter. Now we bind our param. We're going to bind the letter equals letter, and we'll change this to param str for param string. Now, we think this will work, but it's not going to work how you would expect. But let's go ahead and run it. If I reload the page, nope, we're not getting anything at all. So what's the problem? Well, let's run through this. Select star from users, that looks good. The condition is where the username starts with some letter. We bind the param letter to J. Well, now we can see where username like J, but we forgot to add the percentage. So now you might be thinking, okay, well, why don't we add it right here? No, that's not going to work. Let's try it. Nope, that's not going to work. You might be thinking, well, you can add it right here. Reload the page. Nope, you can't do that because you cannot pass the parameter by reference. So what we could do is add it right up here. Reload the page, and we would think that would work, but no, we're not getting anything at all. And notice how we have wrapped this within double quotes. When we're binding the params, we don't need to worry about that. So I can get rid of that like there. Now if I run it, now we are getting that array that we were looking for. Good. So if you were doing this in a project, you would either want to add the percentage directly to that value like that, maybe after the fact. You could not do it like I said earlier, like this, because it's going to assume that you're passing by reference, as we can see right here. So another way would be to go back to this way where we pass an array. And then in that case, we could do letter, and you could bind letter percentage like so. And that should work, and yep, it does. So we went off on a tangent there. Let's come back to what I was talking about with the fetch method. Notice that the way it's returned is just a bunch of arrays, but what if we want to interact with them as an object? Well, we could say PDO fetch object when we run it. And now if I reload the page, we're getting objects now, and we can interact with them in that way. So the default, if I come back and reload, is notice that it returns the values in two different ways. One as an associative array and another as numbered items. So if you want to only return PDO fetch associative array, that will limit that. We have fetch object. There's actually a handful. There's fetching a class if you want to do object mapping, but we're not quite there just yet. So I like to stick with fetch object. Now we can either specify this parameter right here, or is to clear this out and say statement set fetch mode equals PDO fetch object. And that will set the fetch mode for all of the queries. Now if I run it, we're getting the exact same thing. Or if we change it to fetch associative array, now we can access those as an array. So it's up to you how you want to work with that. So what we have here is very procedural code, and that's okay. In the previous lesson, we took a look at abstracting that away to functions. I encourage you to do the exact same thing for this code. The most important things to take away are the way that we prepare the query. This is a far more secure way than using the old MySQL's query method, because the data that we are binding to the query is never actually embedded into the query. It's attached or bound after the fact. And that way, we never have to worry about SQL injection. At least, hopefully not. Fingers crossed. So I just want to show you two more things and then we'll be finished up for the day. notice how we had this section right here, while row equals statement.fetch. And if you remember in the previous lesson, we did this thing where we created a rows array, and then we filtered through as we fetched the items and filled up that array. Now, with PDO, we can make this a little bit easier on ourselves. I'm going to comment this out, and instead, this time, I'm going to run statement fetch all, like so. So what this will do is it's going to fetch all of the records for us. So let's return that within result, and just for now, print our result to see what we get. There we go, and now we have this array that contains all of the items. And sometimes that can be an easier way. If there's not many records and you just want to fetch them all in one clump, you can do that, and then that is what you filter through within your view. So the last thing that I want to show you, if I delete this, is an easy way to perform multiple executions. So for example, what if I were to change this to insert into users, the username, and the values will be the username that we specify there. We're not getting a fetch mode, we're only inserting in this case, so I can clear that out. And now what we're going to do is, once again, I will run statement bind param, and we're going to bind to the username, and the value will be whatever is stored within this variable username, and we know it should be PDO param string. It is a type of string. So check out how cool this is. We'll set username equals Amy Doe, and I'll run statement execute. That's one execution. Now we can duplicate this though if we need to do more. Now we'll change this to Bobby Doe, and the third one will be Cliff Doe. So now notice that we have prepared the query exactly once, and now we're just setting the username, then executing it with that bound param. We're changing it again, and then changing it a third time. So let's see what happens. Let's reload the page. And right here you see we're getting a general error, but that's okay. If we come down, that's only because I accidentally kept that fetch all. And then let's try it again, but before we do, let's make sure that we just delete everything from the users. So select star from users. There we go. And now we can start over. I'll reload the page. We don't get any error. We didn't provide any feedback, which you would want to. But now if I select star from users, notice that we've added those 3 items. But the cool thing is we only ever had one query. So you could even change this. You could say users equals an array, Amy Doe, Bobby Doe, Cliff Doe. And then you could say for each users as user, statement execute. And then let's get rid of these right here. All right, let's one more time delete everything from the users table. That's blank. Now we run it in the browser, and we get an error, column username cannot be null. And that's because I called it user, I should have called it username. One more time, that runs, select star from users, and that's the same thing. You want to be a little careful about that, but if you know what you're doing, that can be super helpful, especially in situations when you're developing and you just want to have a task that will seed a database table with a bunch of records. Prepared statements are a great way to go about doing that. So we covered a lot in this lesson. We have a lot of code, a lot of commented out code. I recommend you probably need to go back and watch this video again, but if not, don't worry. In the next video, we're going to take all of this stuff that we learned and mold it into a little project so that we can reuse some of these functions that we'll create. Stay tuned.